Hey, what's up guys? So today I'm going to tell you about how you can get great footage with one of these 360 cameras. Now this is specifically about the Insta360 One X, which I think is the best amateur 360 camera that you can get. Now there's several pro options out there, but most of them are several thousands of dollars. This on the other hand is under $1,000, and it's got great software that can help you produce some cool footage. All right, so first things first, let's compare the footage coming out of the Insta360 One X with the footage coming out of the GoPro Hero 7. How does it compare? Because I think a lot of people are wondering whether or not they can replace their regular action camera with one of these 360 cameras. Now on paper, that seems like it's a great idea, but in reality, it's actually not. Now there are several reasons for this. The main reason is that this type of a camera is going to require a lot of post-production. Secondly, it has great stabilization, but it comes at a cost, and that is image quality. Now, if you're a first-time action camera buyer, I would highly recommend you to not going to get one of these 360 cameras. In fact, I wouldn't recommend you to going to get one of these Hero 7s because they can be kind of expensive, and if you're a first-time buyer and you're unsure whether or not you want to get into this, then go get like a Hero 5 or the Sony X3000, which is still a really good action camera. So why would you get one of these 360 cameras then? Well, you can get some really cool special shots because of its stabilization and because you can adapt the angle where you're looking in post-production. So if you already own an action camera and you're doing some productions for instance, YouTube, and you want to up the quality of your production, then you can get one of these cameras. Now let's go out and look at a couple of cool shots that you can get because of the features of this camera. So one cool place to mount your 360 camera is on the front of the bike, filming yourself. Now this is cool because of the stabilization capabilities of the camera. So it looks like the camera is standing still and then you're moving in relation to the camera. Another cool shot is to put the camera on a selfie stick, and it's going to look like the camera is just floating in the air. Another cool thing about this is because of the way that the camera is mounted, this mount is going to look like it doesn't exist because it gets cut when the footage is stitched together. Now another cool shot is to get one of these special mounts that you use as a backpack where the camera is mounted behind you. Again, this is cool because of the stabilization capabilities of the camera where it looks like it's floating and you're moving in relation to the camera. Now again, a very special shot. And another thing to think about when you're using one of these mounts is that it's very dangerous if you go down. So therefore, be very careful if you're riding with one of these mounts. Another cool place to put the camera is on the side of the helmet like this. Now the reason this is cool is again because of the stabilization capabilities of the camera, where it looks like the camera is stable in relation to the helmet. One of the first accessories that I got for this camera was one of these GoPro mount adapters. Now the reason for this is because I had so many different GoPro mounts and because there are so many different GoPro mounts out there. Link to one of these below in the description. Another type of shot that you can do with this camera because of its features is a drive-by shot, where you drive by the camera and then you can follow yourself without having to have a cameraman involved. In my humble opinion though, the quality of the footage that you're getting out of this camera is simply not good enough to do this type of a shot. Now you might be wondering, why not use an action camera with a gimbal instead of the 360 for these types of shots? Because this would create the same type of an effect that I just talked about, where it seems like the camera is stuck in one place and you're moving in relation to the camera. Well, the thing with this type of a setup is that it's kind of a pain in the butt to set up. You don't always know that you're going to get the shot that you want, and sometimes the gimbal gets stuck at a certain angle, which can be very annoying when you're out shooting these types of videos that I do. So I actually prefer to use a 360 camera for these types of shots, where I can just smack the camera right here and then just hit record and it's going to give me the shot. I can always adjust the angle of view in post-production. So again, this would create better quality footage, and for some shots I still use this setup. But most of the time it's just more convenient to use a 360 camera. Alright, now let's go home and I'm going to show you guys how you deal with the post-production and the settings of this camera. The reason I would recommend the Insta360 One X above other 360 cameras to shoot these special shots is because of its simplified workflow in post-production. So you can actually edit all the footage in your phone without having to stitch it beforehand. It's very simple. Let's try it. So you get the Insta360 app on your phone, and then you connect your phone to your camera, and then inside here you can find the footage that you've shot. So this is the footage that I shot today for this tutorial. So let's click on one of them. And as you can see here, this is really cool. You can actually see the stitched footage right in your phone. This is something that I believe you cannot do on any other 360 camera. So now, in order to select the footage which we want to edit, we scroll down to see where we got the nice shot that we want to put into our edit. Perfect. All right. So now we download this shot and then we can edit it. All right. So now let's start editing. It's very simple. You essentially pick a pivot point and you hold it like this. And now you're essentially saying, look at this spot right here. And then you can continue inside of this shot and effectively say like, oh, and you're supposed to be transferring over here. It essentially works like key points in any other editing program. So it's very, very straightforward, very, very simple. So the way that this looks is like this. See how it rotates around and changes the angle of view we have of this shot. So very, very simple. And if you want to share this clip with friends, you can just click right up here and you can, for instance, share it on Facebook or YouTube. Users like me, though, would prefer to edit this footage on my workstation, so let's go check that out. Now let's transfer this footage into my workstation and see how we can work with it in Final Cut Pro 10. I like to transfer this type of footage using an adapter, so I take the micro SD card and then put it into this adapter. It's much faster than plugging this thing in with a cable into the workstation. Let's check this out. Let's start out by transferring the files to our computer. As you can see, these files are a special format from Insta360, which I think is the secret sauce for how you can edit that stitch footage inside of your phone. Alright, now let's open up Insta360 Studio. Because we're going to edit this in Final Cut Pro 10, we're going to have to stitch the footage before we pull it into the program. So you simply drag and drop the files into Insta360 Studio, and now we're going to select which parts of the footage that we want to edit. So you simply drag these sliders to where you want to capture the footage, and then you render that footage, and then we're going to drag and drop that stitch footage into Final Cut Pro 10. Something that's important here is to select lock direction, which is something that I discovered is very important when you're riding a motorcycle, because otherwise the camera is going to be floating around everywhere, and it's going to be very hard to lock it down to where you want to be looking. Okay, so now let's render this footage. I always select superb bitrate, which is 150 megabits per second. Now the cool thing about Insta360 is that it's very fast at stitching this type of footage. What I noticed is that the GoPro Fusion is just super slow in comparison with this camera. And that's the reason why I got this camera instead of the GoPro Fusion. While this is rendering, let's check out another YouTube channel which uses a lot of 360 footage, and that is Fort9. I noticed this a couple of months ago, that almost for every single riding shot where the camera is mounted on the motorcycle, they're using what looks like a GoPro Fusion. But because they have an entire crew working with them, that might be fine. But for me, doing the entire production myself, that simply does not make any sense whatsoever. Now let's drag this stitched file into Final Cut Pro 10. What this is a file which sees the entire 360 degrees of view. Now the cool thing about Final Cut Pro 10 is that it recognizes that this is a 360 file and then automatically adapts all the settings to it. So effectively what we're doing is just telling the program where we want to look inside of this 360 degrees of view. So now let's find ourselves in here. So it's right there. And then what you do, if you want to adjust going in between this view and say looking behind, we would essentially pick a key point right here and then drag this to where we want to switch this view. And then we would select another key point over here. So it essentially rotates the camera in between these two key points. It works in exactly the same way as key points works in other programs, so it's very straightforward. Now if you used key points before in any type of editing program, this is going to be very straightforward. Now I could go deeper into this, but I think for this tutorial, it's best to keep it simple. And I think you guys can experiment with using all these settings inside of this program or any other program that's prepared to use 360 files. So that's how simple it is to edit 360 footage with Final Cut Pro 10. What about the settings? Well, just as with the editing, you set this camera up inside of the app in your phone. For footage on your motorcycle, I would recommend you to use 5.7K 30 frames per second. Now, if you've seen my video on GoPro footage, you probably remember that I recommend people to use 60 frames per second. 60 frames per second does not exist for this camera. What exists is 25 frames per second for 5.7K, 24 frames per second for 5.7K. You can also shoot 4K 50 frames per second and 3K 100 frames per second. Now 4K 50 frames per second sounds like it could be a good idea, but the problem is it doesn't really work, at least for my workflow, because I use either 60 frames per second or 24 frames per second. I would never use 50 frames per second. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And then 100 frames per second, well, it could make sense if you're doing some slow-mo, but the quality of that footage is just so bad that I'm not sure what I would use it for. Again, if it's just a couple of seconds of some cool shot where you're using the stabilization and the fact that you can move around the point of view, maybe it works. Maybe you can figure out a really cool shot to do with that, but I can't really figure it out. What about the other settings? Well, I would highly recommend you to use ISO 400 to get as good quality image as possible. And then auto shutter speed, auto white balance because it's decently good at setting the white balance. And then absolutely do not shoot in log. So log is a so-called flat color profile, and it works if you have a high quality camera. If you try to color grade this footage, it's not going to come out very good. So I would highly recommend you to not use the log profile. What about the microphone? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's horrendous for motorcycle usage. But so is any internal microphone in any type of small camera that you would use for this type of footage. So go ahead and look at my GoPro tutorial if you want to know more about how to do an audio setup. But in short, you need a separate audio recorder and a separate microphone that you can hide from the wind. If you can do that, you're going to get much better audio. So I would never use the audio from this camera. Some final thoughts on this camera in this tutorial/review. Well, first of all, it's important for you guys to know that Insta360 did not send me this camera. I bought this myself because I think it is a good camera. But again, I wish to repeat myself. This is a highly specialized camera that you should use for special shots that just last a couple of seconds. I would not recommend you to get this camera if you want to use it as your main action camera. Secondly, the battery life in this thing is horrendous. It lasts for tops 30 minutes. Even worse if you're connecting it through Wi-Fi to your phone, when it lasts like 10 minutes. So it was quite an effort to film this tutorial with this camera. Again, it works if you're just getting that special shot for a couple of minutes. Thirdly, it's not waterproof, which yet again goes to prove that you can't use this as your main camera. So that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. If you guys want to see more of my content, please consider subscribing and hit that bell notification button to be notified when my videos are coming up. Now I gotta run because I'm preparing for a supermoto competition next weekend, and I'm hoping to do really well there. So as always, see you next time!